Glad you're here with us for On Course with Liberal Arts today. The topic is the meaning of the election of 2020. It's my honor to introduce you to our expert speaker, Dr. H.W. Brands. Dr. Brands earned his doctorate degree in history right here at the University of Texas. Prior to that, he received his bachelor's degree in history from Stanford, and also 2 graduate degrees in history and mathematics. He's worked as an oral historian at UT Law School and then taught at Vanderbilt and Texas A&M universities. In 2005, he returned to the University of Texas, where he holds the Jack S. Blanton Senior Chair in History. He's written 30 books, co-authored or edited 5 others, and published dozens of articles and scores of reviews. His articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, the Atlantic Monthly, the Smithsonian, and many other newspapers, magazines, and journals. His writings have received critical and popular acclaim. Several of his books have been bestsellers and finalists for the Pulitzer Prize and the Los Angeles Times Prize. So we're all very lucky to be here with him. If you have questions for Dr. Brands throughout the talk, please type those into the chat function. We'll answer as many questions as possible in the last half of this webinar. And now I'll turn it over to Dr. Brands.
Well, thank you, Angie, for that kind introduction. I'm delighted to be with you all, with my fellow Longhorns, friends of the College of Liberal Arts. I am teaching a course in presidential history. I teach it about every other year, and I make a point of teaching it in the fall of years that are divisible by 4. So my students get to see the next chapter in presidential history unfold. And this is one. So I'm teaching my class virtually, and because it's a large class, I'm teaching it asynchronously. So I am not actually meeting with the students. I'm recording lectures ahead of time, and then I post them on YouTube and they watch them at their leisure. And then I discuss it with them one-on-one and with their TAs. But the reason I say this is that I have recorded the lectures for September and October, but I stop when I get to the beginning of November because, well, this is both the exciting part and the sometimes disconcerting part of teaching a course on presidential history when you are in the middle of electing another president. And I have taught this course at least since the 1990s. And I remember, in fact, that I was teaching this course on the evening of Election Day in 2000. And I was talking to the students, and I had it was the web feed from CNN, I think, up on the screen behind me. And it was an evening course. And so the various, well, CNN in this case, was calling the various states for one candidate or another. And I remember when I was trying to say something, and all of a sudden the attention of the students was riveted on the screen, and there were various ooh, when Florida had been called for Al Gore. And many of you watching today will remember that, okay, and that looked like it put Al Gore over the top. And then I said, okay, well, it looks like Vice President Gore is going to be the next president of the United States. And then I sort of continue. And about half an hour later, there was kind of another sort of riveted stare at the screen and another, when CNN, I think it was CNN we were looking at, had to sort of say, wait a minute, it's too close to call. So it goes back. And then, of course, that one, the outcome of that election played out over the next month, which was a great lesson for my students because the course continued up until just about the time that the Supreme Court weighed in and made the decision in the case. So I've been doing this for a while, and the students really get engaged. Many of my students are first-time voters in the fall that they're taking this class. And so they are particularly engaged. Anyway, this is background to say that it's unfortunate that this particular semester and this particular election is one where I'm not meeting with the students face-to-face because they have lots of questions about it. They will have lots of questions. I have yet to record the lectures for November because I don't know how this is going to turn out. And I've studied presidential history, I've studied American history, and so I know how things turned out in the past, but I don't have any greater insight into how this one's going to turn out than anybody else does. But I will say that the election, however it does turn out, and whenever it does turn out, and this is a critical angle of this as well, and we'll see this. I have been dodging questions on the meaning of the Trump presidency for the last nearly 4 years. And I've been exercising the historian's prerogative in all questions relating to something happening now to say it's too soon to tell. And I think that this is quite true, but I've always said I can say that until Election Day 2020. And after that, then I will be able to tell you the meaning of the Trump presidency, as I will explain. So in American history, presidents are rated sort of by people, well, like me, although I actually refuse to take part in these ranking of presidents because they're kind of interesting from the standpoint of generating page views. But can you really compare George Washington in the 17th, 18th century to Franklin Roosevelt in the 20th century? And one of my points is no, well, actually, you can say he was an effective president at his time. Franklin Roosevelt was an effective president at his time. But to think that you could take George Washington somehow out of the 1790s and transplant him into the 1930s and expect any comparable performance is quite ahistorical. In fact, one of the points that I make in the class is that successful presidents are creatures of their time. Andrew Jackson was a powerful figure and an engaging figure in the 1820s, but he would have been out of his depth and out of his moment by the 1870s and certainly in the 20th century. Theodore Roosevelt was an advocate of big government. So would Theodore Roosevelt be a progressive today? Because progressives today, and he was even called a progressive, progressives today want bigger government. Would Theodore Roosevelt, if he were alive today, want bigger government? And I have no way of answering this question. I do know that Theodore Roosevelt wanted bigger government than existed in 1901 when he became president. But the size of the federal government in 1901 was probably at 20th the size of the federal government today. So Theodore Roosevelt might have thought that the government should be 3 times, 5 times as big as it was when he became president. And still he would think that it should be much smaller than it is today. Anyway, so all this is by way of saying that my students, all of us, live at a turning point in history. And the reason that I will say that, the reason I'll have to stop saying it's too soon to tell about the presidency of Donald Trump is that he will or he will not have been reelected. Now, one concern that I have, and plenty of other people have, is, well, when will we know if he has been reelected or not? I'll go into this a bit more. But if he does get reelected, then his presidency until now and then following will be considered an important presidency. You might think it's a good presidency, you might think it's a bad presidency, but you'll have to concede that it's an important presidency. Why? Because the mere fact of getting reelected lifts any first-term president into the rank of the top dozen or 15 presidents. If in American politics, I'll exaggerate here when I say that anybody can get elected once. No, it's not true that anybody can get elected once. But people get elected the first time on their promises. So if they can make persuasive promises, and sometimes the promises are grand visions of a future to come. Sometimes the promise is simply, I won't be like that scoundrel, that lousy president who happens to be there right now. Franklin Roosevelt made no grand promises when he ran in 1932, but it was sufficient for him to say, I'll do better than Herbert Hoover. And a majority of voters agreed. So presidents get elected on the promise. They get reelected on the performance. The United States does not have a parliamentary system of government. So we don't have votes of confidence or no confidence. But the closest thing we have to them is a reelection of a president. So the president basically stands up or puts himself before the public and says, vote me back into office. You've seen what I can do. Do you like it or not? And if voters say, no, we don't like it, and the president doesn't get reelected, then that president is immediately relegated to the bottom 2/3 of American presidents, regardless of what that president accomplished in his first term. The elder George Bush is already being, I think he will continue to be, unfairly categorized in that lower group. I think he had a very successful presidency, but the mere fact that voters said, no, we don't like what you did, means that he's never going to attain the stature of a president who ran for re-election and got re-elected. So if Donald Trump gets re-elected, then one can only conclude from that that voters, or at least an operative majority of voters under our electoral college system, and this is important, it might not be a majority of the popular vote, but our system is, if you get a majority of the electors, you're president. And so those are the rules. If he wins under those rules, then he will be able to say, his supporters will be able to say, even his critics will have to say, the American people, that is, an operative majority of the electorate, liked what he did. And he will be encouraged to go on and do more of the same. If, on the other hand, he loses, then the inference to be drawn from that is, well, okay, voters liked him enough before they actually met him, before they actually saw him as president to elect him. But once they saw him as president, they said, nah, we don't like you, get out of it. And this has really important ramifications for what the direction of America is going to be. Because in his first, and so far only term, President Trump has taken the United States in a direction very different than it has pursued for the previous 70 years, 75 years, since the end of World War II. Since the end of World War II, the United States in foreign affairs had taken the position, and the American president had taken the position, that the United States needs to be the leader of the free world, a term that was in common use during the Cold War. And the American president has to stand up before the world for American values of democracy, equality, fair play, the rule of law, the whole thing. And American presidents, every American president, took that very seriously. And American presidents also recognized, or at least concluded, that a part of their obligation as president of taking office was to reach beyond their own electoral base, reach beyond their own party, and cast themselves as attempt to be a president of all the American people. The president and the vice president, sort of in parentheses, those are the only two offices where all voters in the United States get to vote for those. Every other election in the United States is divided geographically or by district or something. It's the president of the United States is the only one that everybody gets to vote for. And even if you didn't vote for that president, presidents historically, from John Adams, the first one, George Washington, he got elected unanimously, they all contend that they will be president of all the people, not just those people who voted for them. The classic statement of this came in 1801 in Thomas Jefferson's inaugural address. Jefferson was elected in 1800 in a contested campaign, but it was contested really not between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, his principal rival, but due to a quirk in the voting then between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, his vice presidential running mate. But it was a bitter campaign, and the two political parties in those days, Jefferson's Republican Party and John Adams's Federalist Party, they said horribly nasty things about each other. The media worlds of the day, we talk about polarized media today and how people live in their own cocoons or their own bubbles. Well, it was fairly similar in the 1790s because there were newspapers for each separate party, and if that was the medium of the day. And if you are a Republican, you read Republican newspapers, and if you were a Federalist, you read Federalist newspapers. And in fact, there was even less accountability in those days regarding what the spokespeople for one side said about the candidate of the other side, because nobody had cameras in their pockets. Nobody could record this stuff, so they could always deny having said it. But after this very bitter campaign of the Republicans against the Federalists, Jefferson in his inaugural address said that we, at a fundamental level, we are all Republicans, we are all Federalists. Now, nobody really believed it. The Federalists certainly didn't, but the gesture was important because Jefferson recognized that I am president now. I've been elected president of all the American people. President Trump has been striking in his refusal to take that position. And President Trump has pretty much confined himself to speaking to and taking positions in favor of that minority of the electorate that elected him. And he's taken the view from strategically and tactically that if he can hold his base, then he can get reelected. So, well, we'll see. But so President Trump is different in that regard. The first president to take that position. Also the first president since Franklin Roosevelt, since before Franklin Roosevelt, to take the view that the United States has no obligation to the international system. It's every country for itself in the foreign policy philosophy of Donald Trump. And whether you agree with this or not, it's a striking separation from policy that had gone before. The position that Franklin Roosevelt established for the United States and that every president through Barack Obama bought into was that the United States benefited from a robust international system, that you didn't have to balance the books every night. If the United States paid more to defend Germany, for example, or Japan, than the Germans or the Japanese did, well, that was okay, because the alternative was that the Japanese or the Germans might decide to rearm themselves. And then there would be a replay of World War I or World War II. So, and the United States, which was the dominant economy in the world in the 1940s, in the 1950s, which could have shielded its markets from foreign competition, decided that free trade was good for the world. And because it was good for the world, it was good for the United States. The United States, many Americans had thought that the United States initially could sit out World War I. No, that didn't work. Could sit out World War II. That didn't work either. And Franklin Roosevelt concluded, the United States is this great power in the world. It's not going to be able to sit out future major wars. So let's do our best to keep them from happening. Well, President Trump has said, no, he doesn't buy into that at all. It's sort of every country for itself. He was the first president to take a lead in overturning the philosophy of free trade, and in fact declaring tariff wars against America's economic competitors, at times it seems against America's allies. Now, it's important to keep in mind that President Trump didn't do this alone. So one thing that I have concluded from presidential history, my study of presidential history, is that, and this might sound cynical, I don't intend it that way at all, that we get the presidents we deserve. Or to put it another way, we get the presidents we vote for. And that's quite straightforward. And so Donald Trump is at least as much a symptom of these trends in American thinking as he is the cause of them. And so Americans have long been restive under the idea that other countries are free riders on America's military power, and that the system of free trade is one that has cost Americans jobs and benefited countries like China to the detriment of the United States. So President Trump became president by channeling much of this dissatisfaction against the status quo. And the question is, will a majority of voters say, we like the direction, this change of direction that you're taking the country in, or not? Now, that's sort of the policy, those are the policy implications in broad terms of the election about to come up. But there's a procedural aspect to it. Now, once you start talking process, it sounds dry, and this is what political scientists engage themselves with, but it's much more than that. Every president before President Trump has acknowledged the importance of democracy, of voting, of a fair count, of a full count, has at least paid lip service to the idea that the more people who vote, the better. Now, sometimes it has been only lip service. And you don't have to look farther than Texas and its neighboring southern states in the era of Jim Crow, from Reconstruction into the 1960s, where there was a very concerted, quite deliberate, successful attempt to suppress the African-American vote. And to put it shortly, black people, by and large, couldn't vote in the states of the former Confederacy. So, they might talk about democracy, but they made sure that only the people that they wanted, or at least some of the people they didn't want to vote, didn't vote. However, it's a different thing. Something different is happening in the Trump administration. President Trump has publicly cast doubts upon the electoral process. Before the election of 2016, when he was merely a candidate, he was asked, will you accept the results of the election of 2016? And he wouldn't say yes. He said, sort of depends on how it turns out. Now, this is something that no candidate in American history had ever done before, and certainly no president had ever done before. If you are going to allow a democracy to function, you have to encourage people to believe that their votes matter and that the election will be fair, even if you know that it's not fair, even if you know that things might have been rigged. In the 1960 election, John Kennedy won a squeaker over Richard Nixon. And Richard Nixon knew that there was probably some finagling with the votes in places like Cook County, Illinois. But he didn't challenge the vote. He said, okay, that's just the way it goes. He had enough respect for the system of democracy to say, you hold the vote and you accept the consequences. Al Gore in 2000. Nobody really knew whether he would have won the Florida recount or not. But when the Supreme Court weighed in, Al Gore graciously stepped aside. So there has never been a case, well, I should continue. In 2016, one of the striking things to me, and I thought this was an ominous portent, was that President Trump, Donald Trump, won the electoral vote, clearly lost the popular vote. But even having won the presidency, contended that the popular vote had been rigged and he had really won the popular vote. And I thought, if this is what he says before he's president, and this was when he was president-elect, what's going to happen if the popular vote goes against him when he's actually president? So this is the first election of my lifetime when I have ever had, or when I think anybody has ever had, any serious concern that the votes will be fairly counted, that people will be allowed to vote, and that there will be a result on election night or maybe in the day or two afterwards. I wouldn't be at all surprised if this particular election is contested. At the moment, it appears that Donald Trump will not win the popular vote, but he might very well win the electoral vote. And so if he wins the electoral vote, then he can say, okay, I won. But there has been enough doubt cast upon voting. The Democrats will likely contest that. But even more worrisome is if President Trump loses the popular vote and loses the electoral vote and refuses to accept the outcome. Now, there's been only one case in American history where there was an election and it was clear that somebody won and a large portion of the country said, we don't accept that. And that was in 1860 when Abraham Lincoln was elected. Now, the South didn't contend that Abraham Lincoln had not won the election. They actually didn't dispute the outcome of the election. They just said, we don't want him to be our president. And several states immediately, and then eventually 11 states, seceded from the Union and the Civil War followed. Now, I don't expect that there will be a civil war. I certainly hope there's nothing like a civil war, but I'm afraid that I wouldn't be surprised if there are protests in the streets. And we have seen that people in America these days come to protests armed. And people get shot and some people get killed. I pray that this doesn't happen, but I'm afraid I have to say that I wouldn't be surprised if it did happen. So The country has never been in this situation before. It's tempting to say that this country has been a democracy for 200 years. It wasn't born a democracy, it was born a republic short of a democracy. It evolved into a democracy by the 1820s. And so therefore it's going to be a democracy forever. Well, I'd like to think that. I'd like to say that I am as comfortable saying for my children are now adults, but my grandchildren, that they will inherit the democracy that I inherited. I certainly hope that's the case, but I am very worried because I don't have anything like the confidence on this subject that I had 6, 8, 10 years ago. So, what's it going to come to? There have been challenges. There have been moments when a president was elected and the members of the other party, the other candidates, certainly didn't like the outcome. In 1824, Andrew Jackson received the most popular votes. He received a plurality, but not a majority of the popular votes. And this was early in the days when there even was a popular vote for president. From the 1790s into the 1810s, most of the electors were chosen by the state legislatures rather than by voters. But by the 1820s, most of the electors were chosen by voters. And so there was actually a popular vote that was regularly reported. And Jackson won more votes than the second place finisher, John Quincy Adams. He won more electoral votes than John Quincy Adams, but because it was a four-way race, he didn't get a majority. And under the rules then in effect, still in effect, although they haven't actually played out for 2 centuries, the race went to the House of Representatives. And in the House of Representatives, John Quincy Adams, the second place finisher in the regular vote, came out as president. Jackson and his supporters, the Jacksonians, they would come to be called the Democrats. The modern Democrats are the heirs of the Jefferson and Republicans. They believed that the election had been stolen. But their response was not to say, therefore we will not acknowledge that John Quincy Adams is president. Their response was to immediately start campaigning for the 1828 election. In fact, Jackson was they didn't have nominating conventions in those days. He was nominated by the Tennessee state legislature before John Quincy Adams was even inaugurated as president in 1825. So the response then was, okay, you don't like the outcome of the election, even if you think the election was stolen. What you immediately do is organize for the next election. You don't take steps to challenge that particular election. I hope that whoever loses this time around, once we discover actually who lost, we'll have the forbearance to do the same thing. And here I would cite as a positive model, again, what Al Gore and the Democrats did in 2000. They had grounds for saying that a Republican-dominated Supreme Court had stolen the election for George W. Bush. There were grounds for making the opposite argument. The Supreme Court made the opposite argument, but nonetheless, none of them said George W. Bush is not president. What they said is we need to mobilize and do a better job next time. Now that has been the saving grace of the American political system. Until now, with the exception of 1860, which is a huge exception, where half the country says, we're taking our ball and leaving, we're going home. And this huge war followed. But with that one exception, the response has always been, however disappointing the election, however many concerns have swirled around the actual outcome of the election, the response has been, okay, we're going to fight harder next time. And if that's the way things turn out this time, then I will be greatly relieved. And I'll just keep my fingers crossed that that's what it comes to. I'd be more than happy to take questions, see what your responses are to this, because you're all living through this too. And once again, I will repeat, I'm a historian. I'm not a seer. And my predictions on what's going to happen in the future are not necessarily any better than anybody else's.
Thank you, Dr. Brands. We do have a lot of questions, and some of them are asking for your crystal ball. But let's start with, what was your feeling on the evening before the 2016 election? Had you made a public or private prediction?
Oh, I had been interviewed many times before the election, and I took it as given that Hillary Clinton was going to win. because I kept saying, see, this is when the historian gets locked in to historical precedent. I said, there's never been a case of someone who has never held public office deciding, you know what, I'm going to run for president and winning. And the first office that an American citizen holds is the presidency. It had never happened before. And I just sort of assumed that what had kept it from happening before would keep it from happening this time. So if anybody asks me today, point blank, to make a prediction, I'll make a prediction, but I have to issue the caveat that I got it wrong in good company in 2016. Yes.
What has caused the general shift internationally toward nationalism and governance by the authoritarian right?
There's a good point. That what is happening in the United States is happening in other countries as well. That there is this idea that the international system that has served, I'm going to say, that has served humanity pretty well since 1945 isn't doing what people want it to do. Now, this is going to sound like no explanation at all. But listeners will have an opportunity to decide whether they agree with this. And I will say, at one level, humans are just really hard to please. And they're hard to please for very long. And this is one of the reasons that I teach history, because I try to point out that things used to be worse. Things could be worse. So I think that many nations have felt that they have suffered from the consequences of globalization, to use a term that brings in free trade and large-scale migration and all sorts of other things. And so in Europe, for example, it was the immigration that was touched off by the Syrian civil war that caused people to feel as though things were out of control. Brexit, the decision for Britain to leave the European Union is part of this, because a fundamental question of politics, or beyond politics, it's of how people interact, is what's the appropriate size of government? What's the appropriate size of the community? And if you just look historically, when things are small, people want them to get bigger, because small doesn't provide everything you want. The United States, in the 1770s and early 1780s, there were 13 separate independent countries, and they were bickering with each other. So people decided, let's form this firmer United States. And so we got the Constitution. And that served purposes until, at least for most of the country, until the 1860s, when the South said, this is too big, so we need to break it up. So whatever the status quo is, there will be people who are objecting to aspects of the status quo. And then there is something else, and that is, when nationalism catches on, when the authoritarian streak begins to take hold in one country, other countries are watching. And they see that what can work there can work here. So I think that the vote for Donald Trump in 2016 was akin to the vote for Brexit, where people thought that the argument in the United States to make America great again, I mean, it's a great slogan, in part because it masks what exactly is going on. Make America great again really is make America small again, because the United States is sort of pulling in its responsibilities for the rest of the world. And so we will treat, America first, and this was one and has remained one of the slogans of the Trump administration. And this is a holdover from the isolationism of the 1930s. And there are arguments to be made. We can't save the world, therefore let's save us. So you just see that there are periods in history where bigger seems to be better, and there are periods in history where smaller seems to be better. And we're at a time when there is this desire to break things up, to break up the international system of globalization, to break up the European Union. In Spain, Catalonia wants to spin off. Scotland wants to get out of the United Kingdom. And so that'll take its course for a while. And then people will become dissatisfied with that, and then they'll want to bulk up again. So it's part of it, but there is this feeling in an age of globalization, people have lost some of the control they like to have over their lives. And it's an easy target. Globalization, free trade is an easy target, because the bad guys are people who don't live in your own country. it's easy to blame stuff on foreigners, whether they're foreign immigrants who are trying to sneak into your country, or foreign workers who are trying to steal your jobs, or the World Trade Organization, foreign bureaucrats who try to tell Americans how they ought to operate. And in a democracy, it's really tempting to blame those foreigners, because if you blame somebody in your own country, you're definitely not going to get the votes of those people in your own country. Foreigners can't vote.
Thank you. Next question, if Trump disputes the election and refuses to leave office, what happens then? Does the law say how to handle a president trying to illegally hold on to power?
So this is a really interesting question. We certainly hope it doesn't come to this. But if there is no resolution, or if the President Trump, has not accepted, let's say, the fact that everybody else thinks that he lost, by January 20th at noon of next year, he will no longer be president. You don't have to have a new president in office for the old president's term to run out. So his term began at noon on January 20th of 2017, and it will end at noon on January 20th of 2021. And so once his time has run out, then he's no longer president. Now, if there is no general agreement that Joe Biden has won, has gotten the majority of the electoral votes, even if there's a new president that's not seated, President Trump is no longer president, and therefore, for example, the military doesn't have to follow his orders, and federal sheriffs don't have to follow his orders. Now, that raises the question, well, what happens if they do follow his orders? What happens if he continues to say this? Now, at that point, we're really on uncertain ground. Will the Washington Metropolitan Police evict him as a squatter in a house that he hasn't paid rent on? I don't know. Will federal marshals do it? I have been encouraged by the fact that the military leaders in the American Armed Services have said, we're not getting involved in politics at all. That's a promising sign. I saw another glimmer of promise from the Republican leadership when President Trump, about a month or 6 weeks ago, floated the idea of maybe postponing the election. And they said, no, we're going to have this election on time. I would feel much reassured if Mitch McConnell and other members of the Republican leadership would say, this is a democracy, we hold elections, we abide by the results of the elections. We, as a party, we're going to do this. Unfortunately, it seems to me that Republican leaders have been so intimidated by Donald Trump that they fear that he's going to turn his frown upon them and his Trump supporters will turn against them. I would hope that, for example, Republican senators who aren't up for election this year could say something like this, because they don't have to worry about this particular election, and they could stand up for the principle that elections are the way we decide our leaders.
Thank you. Given the discrepancies in popular and electoral votes in 2000 and 2016, some have called for a change to the Electoral College. The direct repeal of the college seems highly improbable right now, but will any of the proposed workarounds see the light, or what will it take to build enough momentum to abolish?
So before I answer this question, which is a very important question, I have to point out that I've gotten this wrong in the past too. So from 1876 until, 1888, from 1888 until the year 2000, there was not an example of an election in which one candidate won the popular vote and the other candidate won the electoral vote. So I used to tell my students, and I've been telling my students this for 20 years, that the Electoral College is this vestige of an earlier age. It hasn't caused any problems in more than a century, but as soon as it does cause problems, to wit, when one candidate wins the popular vote and the other candidate wins the electoral vote, then it will be quickly repealed because everybody will realize, oh my gosh, we don't want this. This gets in the way of democracy. So I was surprised. And actually, I was quite disappointed that after the 2000 election, when Al Gore won the popular vote and George W. Bush won the electoral vote, that there was no particular groundswell of demand to get rid of the Electoral College. So I'm convinced that we're stuck with the Electoral College. We're stuck because the Electoral College benefits small states, which are overrepresented in the Electoral College because they're overrepresented in the Senate. So, and secondly, because amending the Constitution requires a positive vote of 3/4 of the states. It's not up to the voters, it's up to the states, and they vote by state. And there's simply more small states than there are large states. And so the small states would have to be voting against what they perceive as their own interests for there to be a direct repeal of the Electoral College. However, there is a workaround that's moving forward, and the workaround is a compact, an agreement among states where they say that they will award their electors to the winner of the national popular vote instead of, as is the case in nearly all states, the winner of the state popular vote. And this will take effect once the number of states that have signed the pledge have a total of electors that's equal to or greater than 270. So when that happens, then, assuming it's allowed to work its way forward, then the winner of the popular vote will, by virtue of this new agreement, also win the electoral vote. I'm certain that this will be challenged by whoever loses that electoral vote, should it come to that. And what the Supreme Court decides on this is a bit hard to say. Interestingly, there was a case that the Supreme Court decided this last summer that said that the states can instruct their electors how to vote. The states can insist, okay, if you were an elector pledged to Donald Trump in 2016, you could not change your mind and vote for Hillary Clinton or anybody else. You have to do this. And if you tried to do this, the state legislature has a right to replace you with another one. So presumably, this says that the states can decide on their own, regardless of anything else, of how the electors shall vote. And if the states sign this, then that would be a way around the Electoral College. And if that is allowed to go forward, and it works for a couple of elections, then it's quite possible that people say, you know what, let's just tidy this up and go ahead and amend the Constitution and get rid of the Electoral College.
What do you think about our two-party system generally going forward, both candidates being neither likable or well-regarded, nor having an issue-based platform? Do you have a loss of faith in both major parties or a prediction regarding systemic change? It seems as if some voters' response to disapproving of Trump's first term or their options, like in 2016, is to not vote.
Yeah, so one of the things that I tell my students is, and many of them again are first-time voters, that you have to vote. You vote any way you want, but you have to vote if you want to have any right to join the conversation. If you don't vote, you have no right to complain. Now, I tell my students that, every vote counts. I have to quietly acknowledge, though, because of the Electoral College, not every vote counts equally. And in a state like Texas that has been solidly Republican since the 1990s, in fact, if my whole class, and I teach a class of nearly 500 students, if my whole class didn't vote, it wouldn't even register. Texas would still vote for the Republican candidate. This is no longer quite so true as it has been for the last 20 years. And it probably won't always be true. So regarding the two-party system, we are stuck with a two-party system. We're not necessarily stuck with the two-party system we have right now. The United States has had 3 separate two-party systems in the course of its history. The first two-party system was the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans of the 1790s. That lasted until the late 1810s, by which time the Federalists disbanded. They actually got on the wrong side of history when they started talking about secession during the War of 1812. So the Federalists, they gave way to the Whig Party. And from the 1830s to the 1850s, it was the Whigs against the renamed Republicans, which were now Democrats. So it was the Whigs against the Democrats. And then in the Whigs declined as the country was splitting into North and South, and the Whigs couldn't figure out how to bridge the divide. And so they disbanded, and they were replaced by the modern Republican Party. Now, since the 1850s, we have had 2 parties, and they've called themselves Republicans, Democrats, the parties we have today. However, there has been a big shift in the makeup of the parties. So today, the Democratic Party is generally seen to be the more liberal, or you could use the term progressive, party. And this means in American politics that Democrats are more comfortable with bigger government, and they are more comfortable with what you could sort of progressive ideas regarding culture and the way people live. Republicans have been the more conservative party, typically wanting less government and being more traditional in their social and cultural views. But that's where the parties are today, but they haven't always been there. So as recently as the 1960s, and this is really important in both the legitimacy of presidents, but also in the possibility of getting Congress to make real change in the laws and in the way Americans live. From the 1850s, the start of this existing party system, to the 1960s, so a century and a little bit plus, both political parties were philosophical coalitions. So there were mostly liberal Democrats, but there were conservative Democrats too. There were mostly conservative Republicans, but there were liberal Republicans as well. For example, in Texas, the only political party that really counted from the 1870s until the 1960s was the Democratic Party. But Texans were just as conservative then as they are now. So within the Texas Democratic Party, there were conservative Democrats and there were liberal Democrats. And very often it was the conservative Democrats that held sway. But the point is that the Democratic Party included a substantial element of conservatives. And the Republican Party, although the more conservative party, also included a large number of liberals. And for example, the elder George Bush, he was a Texas Republican. He was originally a Connecticut Republican, but then he was a Texas Republican, but he was liberal. The consequence of this was that during the 1960s, for example, when Lyndon Johnson, a liberal Democrat, wanted to persuade Congress to pass civil rights reform, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, eventually the Fair Housing Act, he was able to get liberal Republicans to sign on. And this makes all the difference in the world. If you are president and you can get legislation that has a bipartisan seal of approval, and when Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act and when he signed the Voting Rights Act, he made sure that in that picture there were Republicans as well as Democrats. The consequence of this was he could say quite sincerely and quite accurately that this was a decision by the American people. This wasn't a Democratic decision. This wasn't a presidential decision. This was something the American people thought was important to do. When Ronald Reagan was president during the 1980s, there were still conservative Democrats, there were still liberal Republicans. Things were changing, and they were changing toward our present situation. They were changing because the National Democratic Party had seized upon civil rights as one of its primary issues going forward. And all those conservative Southern Democrats said, wait a minute, this is no longer my party. And this migration out of the Democratic Party began. It started in the 60s, it continued through the 80s. By the 1990s, in Texas, it was complete. So that to be a viable statewide politician in Texas by the 1990s, you had to be a Republican. Now, these were all people whose fathers and grandfathers had been Democrats. And their philosophy wasn't any different than their fathers or their grandfathers. It's just the name of the party. But what this meant was that Ronald Reagan by the 1980s he was a Republican. He could still get Democrats to vote for his welfare reform, his immigration reform, his tax cuts, his deregulation, all this stuff. And it had that legitimacy, it had that credibility of being bipartisan. But by the year 2000, the sifting out had been completed. The two parties were like this. The Republicans, the Democrats is my left hand. So the Democrats were mostly liberal, but there were enough conservatives. The Republicans were mostly conservative, but there were enough liberals that there was overlap. By 2000, they had pulled apart like this. And so you couldn't find a conservative Democrat, you couldn't find a liberal Republican. Example of this was when the Barack Obama administration, Democratic administration, wanted to do something about healthcare reform. And initially, really knocked itself out to bring Republicans on board for what came to be called the Affordable Care Act. But the Republicans, they had concluded, we don't want to play ball at all with a Democratic president. And so the Affordable Care Act was passed with not a single Republican vote, which meant that Republicans have been able to say, we didn't pass this, and they've been campaigning against it ever since, despite the fact that it's pretty popular and it's not going away. So we live in a period of greater polarization in that regard. It's not just that the Republicans and the Democrats are any more sort of partisan than they were. It's just that there's no philosophical overlap between the two of them anymore. One last thing on this subject, and one of the things that makes it work the way it does, makes it malfunction the way it malfunctions, is that the system of writing congressional districts has been perfected, to, if I can use that term, with use of computers and various other data sets, so that it's possible for the dominant political party, every time there's a census in a state, to say, okay, we're going to create as many safe seats for our party as possible. Now that means making safe seats for the other party as well, but a smaller number. The result of this is that the only election that counts in most congressional races is the primary election. Because if you can win the Republican nomination for most Texas Democratic seats, Texas congressional seats, you're going to win the general election. But if you look at places in Houston and Dallas and San Antonio, if you can win the Democratic primary, then you'll win that seat. So what this means is this encourages partisan behavior, because in primaries, it's the most zealous, the most extreme members of political parties that come out. If you are a Republican member of Congress, you look only over your right shoulder because you're going to be blindsided from your right. If you're a Democratic member of Congress, you look only over your left shoulder. Under those circumstances, it's really hard to find the common ground. And it encourages the two parties to make sure that they keep the argument going rather than come up with a solution. And that's where we are now. To take the example of immigration. There are the decisive elements in both parties that are happier being able to use the issue of immigration as a stick to beat over the head of the other party, or more precisely, to energize their own base and get their people to turn out. If there should be a solution to the problem, then they've lost that. So they don't have an incentive to solve the problem.
We'll have two questions left. The first one is a two-parter. Is a vote to have a stronger leader meaning a vote for a dictator? And also, were there any other presidents whose first term scared some of the electorate into believing that a second term would result in an authoritarian regime?
I'll start with the second half of the question. There were some people, including some Democrats, who worried that Franklin Roosevelt had become so powerful in his first term that the New Deal, and in fact the first 100 days, which sounded ominous because the 100 days, that concept came from Napoleon's 100 days. And so, wait a minute, Franklin Roosevelt and Napoleon? Yeah, so there were Republicans who claimed that Franklin Roosevelt was making himself a dictator. Now, it's one thing for opposition politicians and their spokesmen to claim something. Did people generally believe it? Well, the answer is no, and Franklin Roosevelt was re-elected overwhelmingly. Oh, but it's worth noting that when, as a result of that, Franklin Roosevelt decided to try to change the rules for choosing Supreme Court justices, the term was packing the Supreme Court, he was rebuffed even by members of his own party. So to get back to what I was saying about this election being different, there has not been a time in American history when a substantial portion of the electorate credibly, seriously believed that the re-election of a president would lead to an authoritarian regime utterly unaccountable to the people. So this one is different in that regard. And the first part of the question was, if you vote for a strong leader, does that mean you're voting for an authoritarian? There is a tendency in that direction. The Romans were astute enough about this to realize that in moments of emergency, sometimes you need a strong leader. And they would vote in dictators who had literally the power of life and death over people in Rome. But the dictatorship was term limited, time limited, 6 months. You get 6 months and then you're done. So the real question is, will the president, will the strong man, will he accept being voted out of office? And so this was a crucial thing. In American history, the test case came in 1800. John Adams was the incumbent. He was the first incumbent to lose. And there were some members of his party, the Federalists, who said, no, stick around. We'll figure out how to keep you in office. But he said no, he wouldn't do it. So the key is, if the incumbent loses, does the incumbent walk away peacefully? That's the test. And the test might be more severe this time. At least there are more people worrying about the outcome of this test than in previous elections.
Thank you. And last question. Does our polarized media make solving the partisan divide more difficult? How did the Romans get rid of their short-term dictator?
If, in the case of the Romans, if the dictator didn't leave, he was assassinated. So we hope it doesn't come to that. Does the polarized media contribute to our partisan split? The answer is yes, to some degree, but I don't think this is an insuperable problem, because I suggested earlier, we had this kind of partisan media back in the 18th and through most of the 19th century. It's really only in the 20th century that the concept of the concept of mainstream media kicked in. In the 19th century, if you lived in New York City, there were 7 or 8 dailies in New York City, and you just chose the daily you wanted depending on your political tastes. It was really only in the 20th century, with the rise of mass circulation papers, and then of especially television networks, that the idea that you had to play it down the middle was something that caught on. One of the reasons the networks had to play it down the middle was the Federal Communications Commission made them do it. There was something called the Fairness Doctrine. But after the emergence of cable television, where there wasn't just this triopoly of television news, now anybody could create a television network. That went out the window. And people now could choose Fox News, you could choose MSNBC, you could choose CNN, whatever you want. So I don't think that's the heart of the problem. I think if this thing is going to be fixed, first of all, the political parties, and I'm going to put the burden on the Republicans right now, because this is where the problem is arising, say that we're going to abide by the outcome of the election. And number 2, something's going to have to be done about the gerrymandering of congressional districts. A number of states have done this. And they've said, okay, we are just going to elect an independent commission that's going to draw the boundaries with no respect to political parties. If that could be done, then the partisanship that has infused votes for Congress will be diminished. So that's where we are. I'm hoping for the best.
Great, thank you. On behalf of the University of Texas College of Liberal Arts Development and Public Affairs teams, we want to thank you, Dr. Brands, and all of our attendees for sharing your valuable time with us.